The room went silent when my brother Ryan stood up, glass raised, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. He looked right at me, at the wheelchair, at the legs that wouldn't move anymore, and he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a nervous sound, but a full rolling laugh that bounced off the walls of the Riverside Grill's banquet room. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, at least I can still walk to my own success." The words hung in the air like smoke. Cameras stopped flashing. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My mother's face went white. My father stared at his plate like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. I didn't flinch. I didn't yell. I just reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small blue case. I set it on the table in front of me, flipped it open, and let the light catch the star hanging from the ribbon. His smile died instantly. The Medal of Honor doesn't need an introduction. It speaks louder than any insult ever could. That was the moment I realized my family didn't just misunderstand sacrifice. They'd been profiting from it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Nathan Carter, and for 8 years I served as a combat engineer in the United States Army. My job was to find bombs before they found my brothers. I cleared roads, dismantled explosives, walked into places most people only see in nightmares. I was good at it, maybe too good, because they kept sending me back. 3 tours. Fallujah, Ramadi, back to Fallujah again. Every time I came home, I promised my mother it would be the last. Every time I went back because the guys over there needed someone who knew what they were doing. On my 3rd tour, outside a small village west of Fallujah, I found an IED buried under a false roadbed. It was sophisticated, layered, the kind that takes time and skill to disarm. I was halfway through the sequence when I saw the secondary trigger, a pressure plate hidden 6 inches to my left. I had 2 choices: step back and let it detonate, taking out the convoy behind me, or finish the job and hope my hands were faster than the clock. My hands weren't fast enough. The blast threw me 15 feet. When I woke up 3 days later in a German military hospital, I couldn't feel anything below my waist. The doctors said I was lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky the shrapnel missed my spine by millimeters. Lucky that I'd only lost my legs and not my life. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I'd traded one kind of usefulness for a lifetime of being someone people looked at with pity. But the Army didn't see it that way. What I did that day saved 11 men. The citation said I displayed extraordinary heroism and selflessness under enemy fire. They gave me the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. The president shook my hand. A general I'd never met called me a hero. My mother cried. My father saluted. My brother Ryan smiled for the cameras and posted about it on social media, like he'd done something worth celebrating. 6 months later, I was back in Columbus, living in a ground-floor apartment in North Columbus, learning how to navigate a world that wasn't built for wheels. Physical therapy 5 days a week. Phantom pain that woke me up at 3 in the morning. A bathroom I had to remodel just to take a shower. I didn't talk about the medal. I kept it in a drawer under my socks. It didn't change the fact that I couldn't walk into my childhood home because there were steps at the front door. Ryan called me 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. His voice had that smooth, energetic tone he used when he wanted something. He told me the family was throwing a celebration dinner, that it had been too long since we'd all been together, that Mom missed me. He said they were renting out the banquet room at the Riverside Grill, that he'd make sure everything was accessible, that I didn't need to worry about a thing. I should have known better. I should have heard the edge underneath the enthusiasm. But I wanted to believe that my family still saw me as more than the guy who came home broken. The night of the dinner, the Riverside Grill smelled like roasted garlic and grilled steak. Soft jazz played over the speakers. The banquet room was full of people I hadn't seen in years. Cousins, aunts, uncles, old neighbors, people from the construction supply business my father used to run. Everyone smiled when they saw me. Everyone said the right things. Thank you for your service. We're so proud. You look good. That last one was always a lie, but I'd learned to accept it. My mother hugged me so tight I thought she'd crack a rib. My father shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes wet. Ryan clapped me on the shoulder and guided me to the head table like I was a guest of honor. His wife Rachel fussed over my chair, making sure I had enough room, asking if I needed anything. It all felt genuine. It all felt warm. I let myself relax. The food came out in waves. Shrimp cocktail, Caesar salad, ribeye steaks with garlic mashed potatoes. Wine flowed. Laughter rolled through the room. My mother told stories about when Ryan and I were kids, back when we used to build forts out of scrap lumber in the garage. My father reminisced about teaching us how to use power tools, how I always measured twice and Ryan always eyeballed it. People toasted. People cheered. Felt like home. Then the cake arrived. Chocolate with buttercream frosting, 2 layers, topped with sparklers that fizzled and popped. Ryan stood up, tapping his glass with a fork until the room quieted. He had that grin on his face, the one he wore in every family photo, confident and easy. He started talking about family, about legacy, about the Carter name meaning something in this town. He talked about hard work, about building things that last, about earning your place in the world through sweat and determination. His voice grew louder, more animated. He gestured toward the banquet room, toward the people gathered there, and he said this was what success looked like. Then he turned to me. He said my name slowly, drawing it out. Nathan. He paused, letting the room's attention shift. He said he admired my service, that what I did overseas took guts. But then his tone changed just slightly, just enough. He said the real battle was here at home, in the dirt and the concrete, building something people could see and touch. He said he'd worked every day for the last 5 years to grow the family business, to turn Brennan and Carter Construction into something Dad could be proud of. He raised his glass toward me, his smile still locked in place, and he said, at least I can still walk to my own success. The room didn't gasp. It just stopped. Silence fell so fast it felt like the air had been sucked out. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate. My father's face turned red, then pale. Rachel stared at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Ryan's grin faltered for just a second, then returned like he thought maybe people hadn't understood the joke. I looked at him, at the glass in his hand, at the people pretending they hadn't heard what they'd just heard. I reached into my jacket, the dress uniform jacket I'd worn because my mother asked me to, and I pulled out the small blue case. I set it on the table. The gold star caught the light from the chandelier above. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what it was. Ryan's face went from confident to confused to something close to fear in the span of 3 seconds. His glass lowered. His smile vanished. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The Medal of Honor said everything words couldn't. I pushed back from the table, turned my chair and rolled toward the exit. Behind me, my mother started to cry. My father's voice rose, harsh and cracking, saying Ryan's name like a curse. I didn't look back. Outside, the November air bit at my face, cold and clean. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the orange glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement, trying to understand how the brother I grew up with had turned into someone I didn't recognize. The call came 3 days later. It was my mother, her voice small and tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. She said Ryan felt terrible, that he'd had too much to drink, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. She said Dad was furious, that they'd been fighting, that the family was fracturing and she didn't know how to hold it together. She said Ryan wanted to apologize, that maybe I could come by the house, that we could talk it through like adults. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't tell her that the medal wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was the look on Ryan's face before he made the joke. It wasn't accidental. It was calculated. That night I called Jimmy Morrison, my platoon leader from my second tour. He'd gotten out a year before me. Went to work for a veterans advocacy nonprofit in Cleveland. We'd stayed in touch, trading messages about life after the uniform, about the things civilians didn't understand. I told him what happened. He listened without interrupting, the way good leaders do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. Your brother's company, Brennan and Carter. They got a federal contract last year. Veteran-owned business preference. I sat up straighter. Ryan never served. Jimmy's voice was careful, measured. Yeah, I know. But the paperwork says otherwise. I pulled up my laptop, still balanced on my knees, and started searching. Brennan and Carter Construction LLC. Founded 5 years ago. Specializing in government contracts, municipal projects, veteran hiring initiatives. And there, buried in the business registration documents, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Was my name listed as a co-founder and partial owner? I'd never signed anything. I'd never agreed to anything. But my name, my service record, and my status as a disabled veteran were all over the company's certification paperwork. The federal contracts they'd won, the grants they'd received, the tax benefits they'd claimed, all of it was built on a lie. A lie that used my sacrifice as a cornerstone. Jimmy's voice came back through the phone. You need to look into this. If they're falsifying federal documents, that's not just fraud. That's a felony. I stared at the screen at my own name glowing in blue text, and I realized something I should have seen years ago. Ryan didn't resent me for getting injured. He resented me for being useful even after I came home. I spent the next 2 days digging through every document I could find online. Public records, business filings, contract awards, anything that mentioned Brennan and Carter Construction. The company had grown fast, faster than most small operations ever do. In 5 years, they'd gone from small residential jobs to multimillion-dollar municipal contracts. Road repairs for the city. Renovations at the county courthouse. A complete overhaul of the parking structure at the Columbus Convention Center. Every single project had been awarded through programs designed to give preference to veteran-owned businesses. The more I read, the tighter my chest felt. There were tax credits claimed for hiring disabled veterans, grant money received for workplace accessibility modifications, loans with favorable terms reserved for service-disabled business owners. All of it legitimate on paper. All of it backed by my name and my military record. I pulled up my bank statements going back 6 years. Nothing. No deposits from the business. No profit sharing. No ownership distributions. If I was a co-founder, I'd never seen a single dollar from it. I called the Ohio Secretary of State's office. A woman with a patient voice walked me through how to request official business documents. 3 hours later, I had PDFs of everything filed under Brennan and Carter Construction LLC. The original articles of incorporation listed 2 owners. Ryan Carter 50%. Nathan Carter 50%. My signature sat at the bottom of the page, neat and clear. Except I'd been in Germany when that document was filed, barely conscious, learning how to breathe without a ventilator. I remembered signing papers in the hospital. The doctors had brought stacks of them. Medical releases, insurance forms, benefit applications, power of attorney documents so my family could handle things while I recovered. I'd signed whatever they put in front of me, too tired and too medicated to read the fine print. Ryan had visited twice during that time. I remembered him sitting beside my bed talking about home, about keeping the family business alive, about making sure everything was taken care of. He'd handed me papers. I'd signed them. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages. There it was, buried in a thread from 3 years ago. Ryan had sent me a photo of a contract signing. Him and Todd Brennan shaking hands in front of a construction site banner. The message said, "Thanks for believing in this. Couldn't have done it without you." I'd sent back a thumbs up emoji, thinking he meant emotional support. Thinking he was grateful I'd survived. I hadn't realized I was looking at my own forged partnership. The VA Medical Center in Cleveland was an hour and a half north on I-71. I made an appointment with Dr. Helen Foster, the psychologist I'd been seeing since I got back. She wasn't just a therapist. She was former Army herself, a captain who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before going back to school. She understood the weight of things civilians never could. I rolled into her office on a gray Thursday morning. The room smelled like coffee and lavender. She sat across from me, notebook open, same calm expression she always wore. I told her everything. The dinner. The medal. The business documents. The forged signature. She listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something down, her face unreadable. When I finished, she set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. She asked me what I wanted to do about it. I didn't have an answer. She said that was okay, that I didn't need to decide right now, but I needed to understand what I was dealing with. She said family betrayal hit different than enemy fire. With enemy fire, you know who's shooting at you. With family, the wound comes from the inside and it doesn't heal the same way. She asked if I'd confronted Ryan directly. I told her no, that I didn't trust myself to stay calm. She nodded, said that was smart, that anger was useful but only if I controlled it instead of letting it control me. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said the medal I'd earned wasn't just for bravery under fire. It was for making the hard choice when the easy choice would have gotten people killed. She said this situation wasn't any different. The easy choice was to stay quiet, to let Ryan keep using my name to avoid the fight. The hard choice was to face it, to demand the truth, and to accept whatever came after. I left her office with a clearer head but a heavier heart. I knew what I had to do. I just didn't know if I had the strength to do it. Jimmy called me that night. He'd done some digging on his end, reached out to contacts at the Small Business Administration and the Department of Veterans Affairs. What he found made my blood run cold. Brennan and Carter Construction had received over $2 million in federal contracts over the past 4 years. They'd claimed nearly $400,000 in tax credits and grants specifically tied to my status as a disabled veteran. The SBA had flagged the company twice for inconsistencies in ownership documentation, but both times Ryan had provided amended paperwork that satisfied the auditors. Amended paperwork with my signature on it. Jimmy said the feds were already watching the company. There'd been complaints from other contractors about bid rigging, about projects being awarded under suspicious circumstances. If I came forward with evidence of fraud, it wouldn't just be a family issue. It would trigger a federal investigation. I asked him what that would mean for Ryan. Jimmy didn't sugarcoat it. Prison time. Fines. Permanent disbarment from federal contracting. Todd Brennan would go down too. Maybe harder since he had priors for financial misconduct from a business he ran in Indiana 10 years ago. I sat in the dark of my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the brother I grew up with. The one who taught me how to throw a curveball. The one who stayed up all night with me when our dog died. Both of us crying in the garage while Dad slept. The one who drove 6 hours to see me when I graduated basic training. Who told me he was proud even though I knew he didn't understand why I'd enlisted. That brother wasn't the same person who'd laughed at me in front of 50 people. That brother wouldn't have stolen my identity to build a fortune. Jimmy's voice brought me back. He said I didn't owe Ryan anything. That loyalty was a two-way street and Ryan had burned his lane to ash. He said the guys who didn't make it home deserved better than having their sacrifices turned into a tax shelter. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing didn't make it easier. I decided to talk to my father first. If anyone could explain how this had happened, how Ryan had gotten access to my documents, my signatures, my entire identity, it would be him. Dad had always been the one who handled paperwork for the family. He'd managed the old construction supply business for 30 years before selling it off when his knees gave out. He understood contracts and liability, and the weight of a signature on a legal document. I drove to the house on a Sunday morning. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Tree-lined streets, modest two-story homes with front porches and basketball hoops and driveways. The Carter house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, white siding with black shutters, a maple tree in the front yard that Dad had planted the year I was born. The steps leading to the front door mocked me like they always did. I sat in my van staring at them, wondering if Dad had ever thought about building a ramp, wondering if it had even crossed his mind. I texted him, "I'm outside." He came out a minute later, coffee mug in hand, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He walked down the steps and over to the passenger side of the van. I rolled the window down. He looked older than I remembered. More gray in his hair. Deeper lines around his eyes. He asked if I wanted to come in. I told him I couldn't, not unless he felt like carrying me. His face tightened. He said he kept meaning to build a ramp, that it was on the list, that things had been busy. I let it go. I asked if we could talk in the van. He climbed into the passenger seat, setting his mug in the cup holder. The van smelled like the VA hospital, antiseptic and rubber. Dad didn't comment on it. I pulled out the business documents I'd printed. I handed them to him. I watched his face as he read through them. Watched the confusion turn to recognition, turn to something that looked like guilt. He set the papers down on his lap. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, I asked him if he knew. His voice came out rough like gravel scraping glass. He said Ryan had told him it was temporary, that he just needed my name on the paperwork to qualify for a startup loan, that it wouldn't mean anything, that I'd never be liable for anything. He said Ryan promised he'd remove my name once the business got going, once they didn't need the veteran preference anymore. I asked when that conversation happened. Dad looked out the window toward the house, toward the life he'd built and the son who dismantled it. He said it was right after I got injured when I was still overseas when nobody knew if I was going to make it. He said Ryan had been desperate. The supply business was failing. They were going to lose everything. Ryan had an opportunity with Todd Brennan, but they needed capital, they needed an edge, they needed something that would make banks pay attention. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked Dad if he signed the documents for me. He nodded. He said he had power of attorney while I was incapacitated. He said he thought he was helping. Thought he was keeping the family afloat. Thought I'd understand once I came home and saw what Ryan had built. I asked him if he understood what he'd actually done. He didn't answer. I told him he'd made me complicit in federal fraud. Told him every contract Ryan won, every dollar he claimed, every tax break he took, it was all tied to my name and my service. Told him that if the government found out, I could lose my benefits, my pension, my reputation. Everything I'd bled for. Dad's hand shook. He said he didn't know. Said Ryan told him it was legal, that lots of families did it, that it was just smart business. I asked him if he really believed that. He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, he said Ryan had paid off the house. Paid off Mom's medical bills from when she had cancer 2 years ago. Paid for his knee surgery. Said the business had kept the family alive when everything else was falling apart. He said it like that justified it. Like survival made theft acceptable. I told him I would have helped if he'd asked. Would have given them every dollar I had. Would have signed anything they needed if they'd just been honest. Dad's voice cracked. He said they didn't want to burden me. Said I'd already given enough. I looked at him, at the man who taught me how to hold a level and read a blueprint and stand up straight when the national anthem played. I said you didn't want to burden me, so you stole my identity instead. He started to cry. Big, silent tears that rolled down his face and disappeared into his flannel collar. He said he was sorry. Said he'd made a mistake. Said he'd fix it. I asked him how. He didn't have an answer. I took the papers back. I told him I was going to talk to Ryan. Told him I was going to get the truth, all of it, and then I was going to decide what to do. I told him he should probably call a lawyer. He asked me not to destroy the family. I told him the family destroyed itself the moment they decided I was worth more on paper than in person. I drove away and didn't look back. Ryan's office sat in a strip mall on the east side of town, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a dental clinic. The sign above the door read Brennan and Carter Construction LLC in bold red letters. 2 trucks were parked out front, both new, both wrapped in company logos. I rolled up to the door and tested the handle. Locked. I knocked. A woman's voice called out that they were closed on Sundays. I knocked again, harder. The door opened. Rachel stood there, Ryan's wife, her expression shifting from annoyed to surprised when she saw me. She said Ryan wasn't there, that he was at a job site in Delaware. I told her I'd wait. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The office was small but well maintained. Desks with new computers. Filing cabinets that actually locked. A coffee station with one of those expensive espresso machines. Framed photos on the walls showed completed projects. Ribbon cuttings. Ryan shaking hands with city councilmen. One photo showed Ryan and Todd Brennan holding a giant novelty check from the Ohio Veteran Business Association. My stomach turned. Rachel offered me coffee. I declined. She sat behind one of the desks, her hands folded, clearly uncomfortable. She asked if everything was okay. I told her that depended on her definition of okay. I asked her how much she knew about the business. She said she did the bookkeeping, handled invoices, managed payroll. Said she didn't get involved in the contracts or the bidding process. That was Ryan and Todd's domain. I asked if she knew my name was on the business registration. Her face told me everything. She knew. I asked her when she found out. She said Ryan told her after they got married 3 years ago. Said he explained it was just a formality, that it helped with taxes, that you were okay with it. I asked if she believed him. She didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and showed her the same documents I'd shown my father. I watched her read through them. Watched her face go pale. She looked up at me, her voice barely a whisper. She said she didn't know it was like this. Didn't know I wasn't actually involved. Didn't know the signatures were forged. I asked her what she thought was happening. She said Ryan told her we were partners, that I was a silent owner, that I'd agreed to let him run things while I recovered. She said she never questioned it because it made sense. Because why would a brother lie about something like that? I told her people lie about everything when enough money's involved. She started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. She said she was sorry. Said she should have asked more questions. Said she trusted Ryan because that's what you do when you love someone. I told her trust without verification was just another word for complicity. She flinched. The door opened. Ryan walked in, saw me and stopped cold. His expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then something harder. He looked at Rachel. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked at me. I didn't look away. He said my name like a question. I said his like a statement. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He said we should talk. Ryan moved behind his desk like he owned the room, which I guess he did. He sat down, leaned back in his chair, and tried on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said it was good to see me, that we should have done this sooner, that family shouldn't let things fester. I didn't return the smile. I set my phone on his desk with the business documents pulled up on the screen. I asked him to explain why my name was on paperwork I never signed. The smile faded. He glanced at Rachel, who was staring at her hands. He looked back at me and his whole demeanor shifted. The false warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder, more calculated. He said Dad had explained it to me, that this was about keeping the family together, about survival. I told him Dad explained that he forged my signature while I was unconscious in a German hospital. Ryan's jaw tightened. He said forged was a strong word, that Dad had power of attorney, that it was all legal. I asked him if it was legal to claim veteran-owned business status, when the veteran in question had no idea he owned a business. He stood up, started pacing. He said I didn't understand how hard it had been, how close they came to losing everything. He said the supply business was drowning in debt, that Mom's cancer treatments had emptied their savings, that Dad's knees were so bad he couldn't work anymore. He said he had an opportunity with Todd, a real chance to build something, but the banks wouldn't listen to him. Nobody wanted to take a risk on a 28-year-old with no collateral and no track record. I asked him why he didn't just ask me. His laugh was bitter, sharp. He said I was busy playing hero halfway across the world, that I'd made it clear the army mattered more than family. He said every time they needed me I was gone, chasing another deployment, another mission, another chance to prove something to people who'd forget my name the second I left the service. I felt heat rise in my chest but kept my voice level. I told him I was serving my country, that I was doing what I believed was right. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. He said, and I was here doing what actually mattered, keeping a roof over Mom and Dad's heads while you collected medals. The words hit like shrapnel. I asked him if that's what he really thought, that my service was about ego, about medals, about anything other than protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He said I could dress it up however I wanted, but the fact remained that when the family needed someone present, someone reliable, someone who wasn't going to get blown up and come home useless, he was the one who stepped up. Useless. The word hung in the air between us. Rachel made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Ryan seemed to realize what he'd said. His expression shifted, softened slightly. He said he didn't mean it like that, that he was just trying to make me understand the pressure he'd been under. I told him I understood perfectly. I understood that he'd used my name, my service, and my injuries to build a business I never agreed to be part of. I understood that he'd claimed hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits meant for actual veteran-owned companies. I understood that he'd lied to federal agencies, to clients, to our parents, and apparently to his own wife. Ryan sat back down. He rubbed his face with both hands. When he looked up, the defensiveness was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. He said he could fix it, that we could make it right, that if I just gave him time he'd figure out a way to make me a real partner, to pay me back, to legitimize everything. I asked him how he planned to legitimize fraud. He said it wasn't fraud if I agreed to it now, retroactively. Said we could backdate some documents, create a paper trail that showed I'd been involved all along. Said lawyers did it all the time. I stared at him. This was my brother. The person I'd shared a bedroom with for 15 years. The person who'd been my best man at my wedding before it fell apart during my second deployment. The person who'd sent me care packages filled with beef jerky and magazines and letters about home. That person was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who thought the solution to one crime was committing another. I told him no. His face hardened. He asked what I wanted then. An apology? Money? My name off the paperwork? I told him I wanted the truth, all of it, and I wanted him to turn himself in. Ryan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. He said I couldn't be serious, that turning himself in would destroy everything, that the business would collapse, that Todd would go to prison, that Mom and Dad would lose the house all over again. I told him that wasn't my problem. He slammed his hand on the desk hard enough to make Rachel jump. He said it absolutely was my problem, that this family's survival was built on what he'd created, that if I burned it down out of spite, I'd be hurting the people I claimed to care about. I asked him if he'd thought about that before he stole my identity. He said he borrowed it, that there was a difference. I told him the federal government wouldn't see it that way. Ryan's expression went cold. He said if I reported him, he'd make sure everyone knew I was complicit, that I'd known all along and only came forward when it was convenient. He said he had emails, texts, messages where I'd thanked him for handling things while I recovered. He said he'd paint me as a vindictive cripple who couldn't handle seeing his brother succeed. The word cripple landed like a physical blow. Rachel stood up, her voice shaking. She said that was enough, that he needed to stop. Ryan ignored her. He kept his eyes on me. He said I should think very carefully about what I did next, that I had more to lose than he did. I asked him if he really believed that. He said I'd already lost my legs, my career, and my wife. Did I really want to lose my family too? I turned my chair toward the door. I told him he'd already made that choice for both of us. Rachel unlocked the door for me. As I rolled past her, she whispered that she was sorry. I didn't respond. Behind me, I heard Ryan kick his chair. Heard something glass shatter against a wall. I kept moving. The drive back to my apartment took 20 minutes but felt like hours. My hands shook on the steering wheel. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't pull in enough air. I'd faced enemy combatants who wanted me dead. I'd stared at bombs that could have vaporized me. I'd woken up in a hospital missing pieces of myself I'd never get back. None of that had prepared me for the look in my brother's eyes when he called me useless and crippled in the same conversation. I pulled into my parking spot and sat there in the dark. The medication bottles in my glove compartment rattled when I opened it. Pain pills I was supposed to take twice a day but usually skip because they made my head fuzzy. I took 2, dry swallowed them, and leaned my head back against the seat. My phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. 3 words. He's not himself. I didn't respond. Another text came through, this one from Jimmy. Got something. Call me when you can. I called him. He answered on the first ring. He said he'd reached out to a buddy at the FBI's white-collar crime division, just to get a sense of how seriously they'd take a case like this. The answer was very seriously. He said veteran fraud was a hot-button issue, that the Bureau had a whole task force dedicated to it, that they'd been looking for a case big enough to make an example out of. Brennan and Carter Construction fit the bill perfectly. Jimmy said if I came forward with evidence, they'd move fast. Warrants, audits, interviews, the whole apparatus. He said Ryan and Todd would likely be arrested within a week. He asked if I was ready for that. I told him I didn't know. He said that was fair, that this wasn't a decision to make lightly, but I should know the clock was ticking. He'd heard through his contacts that the SBA was planning another audit of Brennan and Carter, this time more thorough. If they found the discrepancies before I came forward, I could still be implicated. The best move was to get ahead of it, to cooperate fully, to make it clear I was a victim and not a co-conspirator. I asked him what happened to victims in cases like this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said honestly it depended. Some cleared their names and moved on. Others got dragged through the legal system for years. Their reputation shredded even after being exonerated. He said the military would probably investigate too, to make sure I hadn't violated any ethics regulations. I could lose my benefits, my pension, even my medal if they decided I'd been complicit. I told him the medal was in a drawer. He said that wasn't the point. The point was that everything I'd earned, everything I'd sacrificed for, could disappear because my brother decided to play games with federal law. I asked him what he would do. Jimmy sighed. He said when he got out, his cousin had tried to pull something similar, wanted to use Jimmy's veteran status to get a loan for a bar. Jimmy had said no, and his cousin hadn't spoken to him in 5 years. But Jimmy slept fine at night because he knew his name meant something, that his service meant something, and no amount of family pressure was worth compromising that. He said I had to decide what my name was worth. We hung up. I sat in the dark van staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me like wet concrete. The pain pills started to kick in, dulling the edges of everything, making the world feel softer and further away. I thought about my father crying in the passenger seat, about Rachel's whispered apology, about Ryan's cold eyes and colder words. I thought about the 11 men who went home to their families because I'd stayed on that ID long enough to finish the job. I thought about the president's hand on my shoulder, the weight of the medal, the citation that said extraordinary heroism and selflessness. I thought about what those words meant if I stayed silent now. The next morning I called Dr. Foster. I told her I'd made a decision but needed to talk it through before I committed. She had an opening that afternoon. I drove back to Cleveland, my head clearer than it had been in days. Her office felt like a sanctuary, calm and removed from the chaos swirling around my life. I told her everything that had happened with Ryan, every word exchanged, every threat made. I told her about Jimmy's advice, about the federal investigation, about the choice in front of me. She listened the way she always did, present and focused, letting me work through it out loud. When I finished, she asked me what I was afraid of. I told her I was afraid of destroying what was left of my family. Afraid my mother would never forgive me. Afraid my father would drink himself to death from the guilt. Afraid that Ryan would end up in a cell and it would be my fault. She asked if I thought it would be my fault. I said I didn't know. She leaned forward slightly. She said fault implied responsibility, and responsibility required agency. She asked if I'd had any agency in Ryan's decision to commit fraud. I said no. She asked if I'd had any agency in my father's decision to forge my signature. I said no. She asked if I'd had any agency in the years of lies that followed. I said no. She asked me what I did have agency over. I said my response. My choice. My next move. She nodded. She said that was exactly right, that I couldn't control what Ryan had done or what consequences he faced, but I could control whether I participated in the lie or stood for the truth. She said the military had taught me to make hard decisions under pressure, to prioritize mission over comfort, to do what was right even when it cost everything. She asked if that had changed just because I wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. I said no. She said then I already knew what I had to do. I sat with that for a long moment. She was right. I'd always known. I'd just been hoping someone would give me permission to choose the easier path. But there was no easier path. There was only the right one, and the one that let me sleep at night. I asked her what I should expect emotionally. She said grief, anger, guilt, relief, probably all at once. She said cutting ties with family, even toxic family, felt like an amputation. The pain was real even when the limb was killing you. But she also said I'd survive it the same way I'd survived everything else, one day at a time, with support and honesty and the knowledge that I'd done the right thing. I thanked her. She told me to call her if I needed to talk after it all went down. She said she'd keep her phone on. I left her office and sat in the parking lot. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled to the name Jimmy had given me. Special Agent Victoria Brooks, FBI. I stared at the number for a full minute. Then I hit call. Agent Brooks answered on the second ring. Her voice was professional, clipped, all business. I told her who I was and why I was calling. There was a pause, then the sound of a door closing. She asked if I was somewhere private. I said I was in my van in a parking lot. She said that worked. She asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. The dinner. The medal. The documents. The forged signatures. The federal contracts. The conversation with Ryan. I sent her photos of every piece of evidence I had. She asked clarifying questions, took notes, confirmed details. The call lasted 45 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said I'd done the right thing by coming forward, that this was exactly the kind of case her division prioritized. She said she'd need to verify everything I'd told her, that there would be interviews and depositions, that I should expect the process to take months. She asked if I was prepared for that. I told her I was. She asked if I understood that my family would likely face significant legal and financial consequences. I told her I understood. She asked if I was doing this for revenge. I told her no. I was doing it because it was the truth. She seemed satisfied with that answer. She said she'd be in touch within 72 hours, that I shouldn't contact Ryan or anyone else involved, that I should keep all communications and documents preserved. She said if Ryan or Todd tried to intimidate me or tamper with evidence, I should report it immediately. I agreed. She thanked me for my service both overseas and now. The words felt heavier coming from her than they did from strangers at airports. We hung up. I sat in the van, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling like I just stepped off a cliff with no idea where the ground was. The decision was made. The wheels were in motion. There was no taking it back. I drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway, watching the city roll past. Columbus looked different somehow, like I was seeing it for the first time. The buildings, the people, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing around me while my world shifted on its axis. I thought about calling my mother, warning her what was coming. But Agent Brooks had been clear. No contact. No warnings. Let the investigation proceed without interference. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me. Footsteps above. A door closing down the hall. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normal sounds. Normal life. Mine was about to become anything but normal. I thought about Ryan's threat, that he'd paint me as complicit, that he'd destroy my reputation to save himself. I thought about whether anyone would believe him, whether the truth would be enough, whether I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I thought about the 11 men who went home because I stayed. I thought about the meaning behind the medal in my drawer. I thought about the oath I'd taken when I enlisted, to support and defend, to bear true faith and allegiance. That oath didn't come with an expiration date. It didn't have a carve-out for family. It meant something or it meant nothing. I decided a long time ago that it meant something. The sun came up eventually. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sky turn from black to gray to pale blue. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Can we talk? I stared at the message. Agent Brooks had said no contact with anyone involved. But my mother wasn't involved, not really. She was collateral damage, caught between her sons, trying to hold together a family that was already broken. I texted back. Not yet. Soon. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then reappeared. Then a single word. Okay. I set the phone down and finished my coffee. The waiting had begun. The FBI moved faster than I expected. 72 hours after my call with Agent Brooks, 2 federal agents showed up at Brennan and Carter Construction with a warrant. I wasn't there to see it, but Rachel called me 20 minutes after it happened, her voice fractured and small. She said they'd taken everything. Computers, filing cabinets, hard drives, even Ryan's personal phone. She said Ryan had tried to argue, tried to call his lawyer, but they'd been calm and methodical, executing the warrant with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing this 100 times before. Todd Brennan had been at the office too. Rachel said he'd gone pale when the agents walked in, said he'd looked at Ryan like he'd been betrayed, which I suppose he had been, just not in the way he thought. She asked me if I'd done this. I didn't answer. She said she understood why, that she wasn't angry, that she just needed to know. I told her the truth always comes out eventually. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Ryan was talking about running, about disappearing before they could build a case. I told her that would only make things worse, that running from federal charges was its own crime. She said she'd try to talk to him, but she didn't think he'd listen. She said he'd barely spoken to her since our confrontation at the office, that he'd been sleeping on the couch, staring at his phone at 3 in the morning, drinking whiskey until he passed out. She said she didn't know who he was anymore. I told her I knew the feeling. We hung up. An hour later my father called. His voice was harder than I'd ever heard it, tight with anger that he wasn't trying to hide. He said the FBI had been to the house, that they'd questioned him and my mother for 2 hours, that they'd asked about the power of attorney, about the signatures, about what he knew and when he knew it. He said they'd made him feel like a criminal in his own home. I asked him if he'd told them the truth. He said of course he had, that lying to federal agents was a felony, that he wasn't stupid. Then his voice cracked and he asked me how I could do this, how I could turn on my own brother, my own blood. I told him Ryan had turned on me first years ago, every time he signed my name to a document I never saw. My father said Ryan had been trying to save the family, that everything he'd done had been for us. I asked him if fraud was a family value now. He didn't have an answer for that. He said my mother was heartbroken, that she'd cried herself sick, that she couldn't understand why I couldn't just let it go, why I had to involve the government. I told him I didn't involve the government. Ryan did that when he committed federal crimes using my identity. I told him I was sorry they were caught in the middle, but I wasn't sorry for telling the truth. He said truth was a luxury we couldn't afford. I told him that was the problem. The call ended badly. No goodbye, just silence and then a dial tone. I sat holding the phone, feeling the weight of everything I'd set in motion pressing down on my chest like a collapsed building. Agent Brooks contacted me 2 days later. She said they'd found everything they needed and more. Bank records showing the flow of federal contract money. Emails between Ryan and Todd discussing how to maximize veteran preference points. Text messages where Ryan joked about his brother, the war hero, being worth his weight in tax breaks. She said the evidence was overwhelming, that they were moving forward with charges. She asked if I'd be willing to testify if it went to trial. I said yes. She said I should prepare for backlash, that Ryan's lawyer would try to discredit me, to paint me as bitter and vengeful, to suggest I was mentally unstable from combat trauma. She said it was a common defense strategy in cases like this, to attack the victim's credibility. I told her I'd been through worse. She said she believed me, but I should still be ready. She said the arraignment was scheduled for the following week, that Ryan and Todd would both be charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and making false statements to federal agencies. She said Todd had priors which would make his sentence harsher. She said Ryan would likely face 5 to 10 years if convicted. I asked what happened to the business. She said it would be dissolved, that any assets would be seized to pay restitution, that the clients with active contracts would have to find new contractors. She said it would hurt people, that some jobs would be left unfinished, that some workers would lose their income. She said that was the collateral damage of fraud. I asked about my parents. She said they weren't being charged with anything, that the investigation had determined my father's role was negligent but not criminal, that he genuinely believed he was helping. She said they'd lose the house though eventually, once the restitution judgments came through. The house Ryan had paid off with stolen money would have to be sold to repay the government. I asked if there was any way to protect them. She said no, that the law didn't make exceptions for sympathetic circumstances, that stolen money was stolen money regardless of where it ended up. I thanked her for being honest. She said honesty was the only thing that mattered in cases like this, that lies had gotten everyone into this mess and only truth would get them out. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment and thought about my parents losing their home. Thought about my mother packing boxes, sorting through 40 years of memories, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Thought about my father sitting in an empty living room, staring at walls that no longer belonged to him. I thought about whether I could live with that. The answer came slowly but clearly. Yes, because the alternative was living with a lie, and I'd learned in the desert that lies got people killed. This wasn't the desert, but the principle held. Lies destroyed things. Truth might hurt, but at least it was real. The arraignment happened on a cold morning in late November. I didn't attend, but Jimmy did, and he called me afterwards with the details. He said Ryan had shown up in a suit, clean-shaven, trying to look respectable. Todd had looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Both had pleaded not guilty. The judge had set bail at $200,000 each. Todd's family had posted his immediately. Ryan's had taken longer. My father had to use the house as collateral. Jimmy said Ryan had looked at him across the courtroom, that their eyes had met for just a second, and in that second Jimmy had seen everything. Rage, betrayal, fear, desperation. Jimmy said it was the look of a man realizing he'd bet everything on a lie and lost. The trial date was set for 4 months out. Jimmy said that was fast for a federal case, that the prosecutor must be confident. He said I should expect to be called as a witness, that I should start preparing my testimony. He offered to help me practice, to run through the questions I'd likely face. I told him I'd take him up on that. My mother called that night. Her voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. She said she didn't understand why this was happening, why everything had fallen apart so fast, why the family she built was tearing itself to pieces. I told her the family had been broken long before I made the call, that I just stopped pretending otherwise. She said pretending had kept everyone together. I told her pretending had kept everyone lying. She asked me if I hated Ryan. I told her no, that hate required energy I didn't have. That mostly I just felt sad that the brother I'd grown up with had disappeared somewhere along the way. She asked if I could forgive him. I told her forgiveness wasn't the same as excusing what he'd done, that I could forgive him and still hold him accountable. She didn't understand the distinction. She said family meant protecting each other, even when they made mistakes. I told her this wasn't a mistake. Mistakes were accidents. What Ryan did was deliberate, calculated, and sustained over years. She started crying. She said she'd lost both her sons, that Ryan was going to prison and I'd become a stranger. I told her she hadn't lost me, that I was right here, that I'd always been here, that the distance she felt was the space the truth took up when it finally had room to breathe. She said she had to go. The call ended with her crying and me staring at the phone, wondering if there would ever be a version of this where everyone walked away whole. The weeks before the trial were strange and hollow. I went to physical therapy, worked on strengthening what remained of my core, practiced transfers and balance exercises that made sweat pour down my face. I met with Jimmy twice a week to prepare my testimony, running through the timeline, the documents, the conversations. He played the role of Ryan's defense attorney, asking hostile questions, trying to trip me up, testing my composure. He said I was solid, that I came across as credible and calm, that the jury would believe me. I asked him what Ryan's defense would be. He said probably that I'd known all along, that I'd been a silent partner who only turned on Ryan when I felt slighted at the dinner. He said they'd try to paint me as vindictive, as someone who couldn't handle his brother's success. I asked if that would work. Jimmy said not with the evidence stacked the way it was, but juries were unpredictable, that reasonable doubt was a powerful thing. He said the prosecutor was good though, that she had a strong record on fraud cases, that she wouldn't let Ryan's lawyer muddy the waters. The trial started on a gray Monday in March. The courthouse was downtown, an old stone building with columns and marble floors that echoed when you rolled across them. I arrived early, dressed in my uniform, the one I'd worn to the dinner months ago. Agent Brooks met me outside the courtroom. She said the prosecutor wanted me to wait in a witness room until I was called, that I shouldn't be in the courtroom for the opening statements. She said it was standard procedure. I waited in a small room with uncomfortable chairs and bad coffee. A bailiff checked on me every hour. I watched the clock tick forward, counting down to the moment I'd have to face my brother across a courtroom and tell a room full of strangers how he'd stolen my life. They called me on the second day. The bailiff escorted me to the courtroom doors. He opened them and I rolled through. The room was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling, high ceilings, rows of benches filled with people I didn't recognize. The jury sat to my left, 12 faces watching me with varying degrees of curiosity and sympathy. The judge sat elevated, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. And there at the defense table sat Ryan. He didn't look at me. His lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, watched me with an expression I couldn't read. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with red hair pulled back tight, stood and smiled slightly. The bailiff swore me in. I placed my hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'd made a lot of promises in my life, but this one felt different. Heavier. More permanent. The prosecutor started with easy questions. My name, my service record, my injuries. She established who I was, what I'd done, why I mattered. Then she moved to the documents. She projected them on a screen for the jury to see. My signature on business filings I'd never signed. My name on loan applications I'd never submitted. My service record on veteran certification forms I'd never reviewed. She asked me if I'd authorized any of it. I said no. She asked if I'd known my name was being used. I said no. She asked when I found out. I told her about the dinner, about the Medal of Honor, about the federal audit notice. I told her about the bank records, about the money flowing to Lowell Group, about confronting Ryan. The jury listened. Some took notes. One woman in the back row had tears in her eyes. The prosecutor asked me how I felt when I discovered what Ryan had done. Ryan's lawyer objected, said feelings weren't relevant. The judge overruled. I answered honestly. I said I felt betrayed, that I'd given everything I had to protect people I'd never meet, and my own brother had used that sacrifice to commit crimes. I said it felt like my service had been turned into a commodity, something to be bought and sold and exploited. The prosecutor thanked me and sat down. Ryan's lawyer stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and approached slowly, like he was thinking carefully about each step. He started by thanking me for my service. I didn't respond. He asked if Ryan had visited me in the hospital. I said yes. He asked if Ryan had seemed concerned about my welfare. I said he'd seemed concerned about a lot of things. He asked if I'd signed documents while in the hospital. I said yes. He asked if I remembered what those documents were. I said some of them, medical releases mostly, but I'd been on heavy medication and didn't review everything carefully. He asked if it was possible I'd signed business documents without realizing it. I said no, that the signature on the Brennan and Carter paperwork was dated 3 weeks before I regained enough motor function to hold a pen. He paused, looked at his notes, changed direction. He asked if I resented Ryan's success. I said I didn't resent success earned honestly. He asked if I'd felt overlooked by my family. I said I'd felt a lot of things, but none of them justified fraud. He asked if I'd been angry at the dinner. I said I'd been surprised. He asked if that surprise had motivated me to retaliate. I looked at him directly. I said the only thing that motivated me was learning my name had been stolen and used to commit federal crimes. He asked if I understood that my testimony would likely send my brother to prison. I said I understood that his crimes would send him to prison. My testimony was just the truth. He asked if I felt any guilt about that. I said I felt guilty that I hadn't discovered it sooner. The lawyer seemed frustrated. He tried a few more questions, circling back to the idea that I was bitter and vengeful, but I didn't give him anything to work with. Finally, he sat down. The prosecutor asked one more question on redirect. She asked if I'd do it all again, knowing what it would cost. I said yes because the truth mattered more than comfort. The judge excused me. I rolled out of the courtroom, past the benches, past my mother sitting in the back row with her hands over her mouth, past my father staring at the floor, past Rachel who met my eyes and nodded once. Outside, the air felt cold and clean. Agent Brooks was waiting. She said I'd done well, that the jury had responded to me, that the defense hadn't landed anything significant. She said the rest of the trial would be technical, financial experts and document analysts, nothing I needed to be present for. She said she'd call me when the verdict came in. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Agent Brooks called me just after 5 in the evening. She said they'd reached a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Ryan and Todd both. She said sentencing would happen in 2 weeks. She said I could attend if I wanted, but I didn't have to. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't attend the sentencing. I couldn't watch my brother stand in front of a judge and hear his future reduced to a number of years behind bars. Jimmy went instead. He called me afterwards. He said Ryan had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Todd got 9 because of his priors. He said Ryan had made a statement before sentencing that he'd apologized to the court, to his family, to the clients he'd defrauded. He said Ryan had cried, that he'd said he'd made terrible choices and he accepted responsibility. Jimmy said it had seemed genuine, but it was hard to tell. He said my parents had been there, that my mother had sobbed through the whole thing, that my father had sat stone-faced until the judge announced the sentence, and then he'd put his head in his hands. Jimmy said Rachel had filed for divorce 2 days before the sentencing. He said the house had been sold to pay restitution, that my parents were moving into a small rental across town. He said the Brennan and Carter assets had been liquidated, that the workers had all found other jobs, that the clients had moved on. He said it was over. Except it wasn't over. Not really. The legal part was done, but the human part would take years to resolve if it ever did. I didn't hear from my parents for 3 months. Then, on a Saturday morning in June, my mother called. She said she wanted to see me, that she and my father had something they needed to say. I agreed to meet them at a park near their new place, somewhere neutral, somewhere public. They were sitting on a bench when I arrived, looking smaller somehow, older, worn down by everything that had happened. My mother stood when she saw me. She hugged me long and tight, and whispered that she was sorry. My father shook my hand. His grip was weaker than I remembered. We sat together in the shade of an old oak tree. My mother said they'd had a lot of time to think, that they'd talked to a counselor, that they were trying to understand where everything went wrong. She said they'd enabled Ryan, that they'd prioritized keeping peace over demanding truth, that they'd failed me by not asking harder questions. My father said he should have known better, That he'd taken the easy path because the hard path required confronting his own son, and he hadn't had the courage. He said he was ashamed. I told them shame was useful only if it led to change. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I said I already had, that forgiveness wasn't the issue. Trust was. She asked what it would take to rebuild that. I told her time and honesty and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths instead of burying them. My father said they wanted to try, that they didn't expect me to forget what happened, but they hoped eventually we could find our way back to something that resembled family. I said family wasn't about blood. It was about showing up, about doing the right thing even when it cost everything, about choosing truth over comfort. I said if they could do that, then maybe we had a chance. 6 months later, I got a letter from Ryan. It was short, written on prison stationery and handwriting that looked rushed and uncertain. He said he'd had a lot of time to think about what he'd done, about the choices he'd made, about the person he'd become. He said he understood why I'd turned him in, that he didn't blame me, that he blamed himself. He said the hardest part wasn't the prison sentence. It was realizing that he'd destroyed the one relationship that had mattered most to him, that he'd traded his brother for money and status and the illusion of success. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he didn't deserve it, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. He said he was working in the prison library, helping other inmates file legal documents, teaching a GED class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He said it wasn't much, but it was honest work, and for the first time in years he felt like he was doing something that mattered. He said he hoped when he got out, whenever that was, maybe we could talk. Maybe we could find a way forward. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because some things take longer to heal than others. A year after the trial, I was offered a position at the VA, working with transitioning veterans, helping them navigate benefits and employment, and the 1,000 small challenges of building a civilian life after the military. The work was hard but meaningful. I spent my days helping people who reminded me of myself, people who'd given everything and were trying to figure out what came next. I started a program pairing disabled veterans with local contractors who needed skilled workers. We called it Second Foundation. The idea was simple. Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild, to take what's broken and make something useful from the pieces. My parents volunteered with the program. My father taught tool safety and basic carpentry. My mother handled intake paperwork and scheduling. We didn't talk about Ryan much, but his absence was always there. A space in every conversation we didn't quite know how to fill. On the 2-year anniversary of the trial, I visited the Ohio State Veterans Memorial. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the light comes in soft and the world feels paused. I stood in front of the wall of names, reading through the lists of people who hadn't made it home. I thought about the guys from my platoon. Thought about the 11 men who went home because I'd stayed on that IED. Thought about what service meant, what sacrifice required, what it cost to live with integrity. I pulled the Medal of Honor from my pocket. I'd started carrying it again. Not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that doing the right thing was never easy, that honor wasn't about glory, that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought against the people you loved. I thought about Ryan in prison teaching GED classes, trying to become someone he could respect. I thought about my parents in their small rental volunteering their time, trying to make amends. I thought about Rachel, who'd reached out last month, who'd told me she was going back to school, studying to be a paralegal, who'd said she wanted to help people understand the law so they didn't make the same mistakes she had. I thought about Jimmy, about Agent Brooks, about Dr. Foster, about all the people who'd helped me navigate the wreckage and find solid ground. And I thought about myself, about the kid who'd enlisted at 18 because he wanted to make a difference, about the soldier who'd walked toward danger when everyone else ran away, about the man who'd chosen truth when lies would have been easier. The sun climbed higher, warming the stone beneath my hand. Somewhere in the city, life continued. People went to work, raised families, built things, broke things, tried again. The world kept turning whether we were ready or not. I put the medal back in my pocket and rolled toward my van. There was work to do, people to help, foundations to build. The past would always be there. Heavy and complicated and impossible to change. But the future was still unwritten. And I'd learned that even broken things could bear weight if you built them right. 3 years into Ryan's sentence, I received a call from the Federal Correctional Institution in Elkton where he was serving his time. The voice on the other end was professional but warm. A counselor named Margaret who said Ryan had requested family mediation through the prison's restorative justice program. She explained that the program brought together offenders and their victims in a structured environment to process harm, seek understanding, and work toward healing. She said Ryan had been participating in cognitive behavioral therapy and had shown genuine progress in understanding the impact of his actions. She said he wasn't asking for forgiveness or release or anything that would benefit him legally. He just wanted the chance to speak to me face to face, to say things that couldn't be said in a letter. Margaret told me I had no obligation to participate, that the program was entirely voluntary, that I should take time to consider whether it would help or hurt my own healing process. I told her I'd think about it. I called Dr. Foster that afternoon. We'd continued our sessions over the years, moving from weekly to monthly as I'd found my footing in civilian life. She'd become more than a therapist. She was a sounding board, a guide, someone who understood the terrain of trauma and recovery in ways most people never would. I told her about the call, about the mediation program, about the question sitting heavy in my chest. She asked me what I was afraid would happen if I went. I said I was afraid I'd see the brother I used to know and want to forgive him before he'd truly changed. Afraid I'd see a stranger and realize the person I'd grown up with was gone forever. Afraid the whole thing would reopen wounds I'd worked hard to close. She asked what I hoped would happen. I said I hoped for clarity, for some sense that the destruction had led to growth, that the pain had produced something other than more pain. She said those were reasonable hopes, that restorative justice could be powerful when both parties approached it honestly. She said the key was going in without expectations, being present for whatever emerged, and knowing I could walk away at any point if it became harmful. She asked if I felt ready. I said I didn't know if anyone was ever ready for something like this, but I was willing to try. I called Margaret back the next day and agreed to participate. The mediation was scheduled for a Saturday morning in late October. I drove the 2 hours to Elkton alone, watching the landscape shift from city to farmland to the stark institutional architecture of the prison complex. The facility sat behind layers of fencing topped with razor wire, guard towers at each corner, cameras tracking movement across every inch of visible ground. I went through security, surrendering my phone and keys and wallet, submitting to a metal detector, and a pat-down that reminded me uncomfortably of military checkpoints. A guard escorted me through a series of locked doors, each one clanging shut behind us with a finality that made my chest tight. We ended up in a small room painted pale green, furnished with a round table and 4 chairs. Margaret was already there. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She shook my hand and thanked me for coming. She explained the structure of the session, that she'd facilitate but mostly listen, that both Ryan and I would have a chance to speak without interruption, that the goal wasn't to relitigate the past but to process it and explore what came next. She said if at any point I felt uncomfortable or unsafe, I could leave. She said Ryan understood that. A few minutes later, the door opened and Ryan walked in. He wore prison khakis, his hair shorter than I'd ever seen it, his face leaner, older. He had new lines around his eyes and a tiredness that went deeper than lack of sleep. He looked at me and I saw something flicker across his expression. Shame maybe. Or fear. He sat down across from me, hands folded on the table. Margaret asked if we were ready to begin. We both nodded. She invited Ryan to speak first. He took a long breath, his eyes fixed on the table. He said he'd spent 3 years thinking about what he'd done. Not just the legal crimes but the personal betrayals. He said the therapy sessions had forced him to examine why he'd made the choices he made, to trace the pattern back to its roots. He said it started with fear that he wasn't good enough, that he'd never measure up, that everyone would eventually see through him. He said when I enlisted, part of him had been relieved because it meant he didn't have to compete with me anymore. But then I'd come home with medals and recognition and a story that made people see me as a hero, and that relief had curdled into resentment. He said he'd convinced himself that my service was performative, that I'd chosen the military because it was easier than dealing with real life, that my injuries were almost karmic justice for abandoning the family. He said he knew now how twisted that thinking was, how deeply selfish and cruel. He said he'd used those rationalizations to justify taking what wasn't his, to build a business on lies and call it survival. He looked up at me then, his eyes red but dry. He said the worst part wasn't the prison sentence or the loss of his business or even the divorce. The worst part was realizing he'd become someone he despised. Someone who'd exploited the sacrifice of the person he'd once admired most. He said he didn't know if sorry was enough, if anything would ever be enough, but he needed me to know he understood what he'd done, and he was trying every day to become someone different. Margaret turned to me. She asked if I wanted to respond. I looked at Ryan, at the man who'd been my best friend for the first 18 years of my life, who'd taught me how to ride a bike and how to talk to girls and how to throw a punch when the neighborhood kids got aggressive. I thought about the brother who'd sent me letters during basic training, who'd been there when I graduated, who'd stood next to me at my wedding and told me I deserved to be happy. I thought about the distance between that person and the one sitting across from me now. I said I appreciated him taking responsibility, that it meant something to hear him acknowledge the harm he'd caused. I said I'd spent a long time being angry, being hurt, feeling like everything I'd sacrificed had been turned into a commodity. I said the hardest part hadn't been the fraud itself but the realization that while I'd been willing to die for strangers, my own brother had been willing to destroy me for profit. I told him I didn't know if I could forgive him, not yet, maybe not ever, but I could recognize that he was trying. I told him that meant something. He asked if I hated him. I said no, that hate required energy I didn't want to spend on him. I said mostly I felt sad for the family we'd been and the wreckage we'd become. Sad for our parents who'd lost their home and their peace, sad for all the ways we'd failed each other. He said he was sad too, that he thought about it every day, that prison gave him nothing but time to sit with the consequences of his choices. Margaret asked what we each needed moving forward. Ryan said he needed to know that when he got out there'd be some possibility of rebuilding, not the relationship we'd had but maybe something new, something honest. He said he wasn't asking for trust or closeness, just the chance to prove over time that he'd changed. I said I needed space, that I couldn't promise anything, that forgiveness wasn't something I could manufacture on demand. I said if he wanted to rebuild, he'd have to do it without expectations, without timelines, without any guarantee that I'd ever be able to see him as a brother again. He said he understood. Margaret asked if there was anything else either of us needed to say. Ryan asked about our parents, how they were doing, if they were okay. I told him they were managing, that they'd moved into a smaller place, that they were volunteering, that they were trying to make amends in their own way. I told him Mom asked about him every time we talked, that Dad still couldn't say his name without his voice breaking. Ryan's composure cracked then. He put his head in his hands and his shoulders shook. He said he'd destroyed everything, that he'd taken a family that wasn't perfect but was whole and shattered it beyond repair. I said it wasn't beyond repair, just that repair looked different than restoration. I said broken things could be mended but they'd never be what they were before, and maybe that was okay. Maybe the cracks were where the light got in. He looked up at me, tears on his face. He asked if I really believed that. I said I had to, because the alternative was believing that nothing good could come from pain, and my entire life was evidence against that theory. The session lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Margaret thanked us both. She said what we'd done took courage, that many families never got to this point, that the willingness to sit in discomfort and speak truth was the foundation of healing. She said the program offered follow-up sessions if we wanted them, that we could continue the conversation as Ryan worked toward release. I said I'd consider it. Ryan said he'd be grateful for whatever I was willing to give. We stood. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do. Then Ryan extended his hand. I looked at it, at the hand that had forged my signature, that had signed contracts in my name, that had built an empire on lies. I also saw the hand that had helped me build forts as a kid, that had pulled me up when I fell off my bike, that had gripped mine at our grandfather's funeral when we were too young to understand death but old enough to feel its weight. I shook his hand. The grip was firm but brief. He said thank you for coming, that it meant more than I knew. I said I didn't do it for him. I did it for myself. He nodded. Said that was fair. The guard escorted him back through a different door. I watched him go, watched the door close, watched the space where he'd been turned empty. Margaret walked me back through security. At the final checkpoint, she said I'd done well, that the honesty I'd brought to the room was rare and valuable. She said healing wasn't linear, that there would be hard days ahead, but the fact that I'd shown up was significant. I thanked her and walked out into the October sunlight. The air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. I sat in my van for a long time before starting the engine, letting the silence settle around me, processing what had just happened. I didn't feel lighter exactly, but I felt clearer. like a fog had lifted just enough to see the path ahead. The drive home gave me time to think. I thought about the things Ryan had said about fear and resentment and the ways we justify our worst choices. I thought about my own fears, the ones that woke me up at 3 in the morning, the ones that whispered I wasn't enough, that I'd lost too much, that the best parts of my life were behind me. I thought about how easy it would be to let those fears shape my decisions, to let bitterness become my default, to close myself off from risk and vulnerability and the possibility of being hurt again. But I'd learned something in the years since the trial. Pain was inevitable. Suffering was optional. I could carry the weight of what had happened, or I could set it down and walk forward without it. The choice was mine. When I got home, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice tentative like she was afraid of what I might say. I told her I'd seen Ryan, that we'd talked, that it had been hard but necessary. She asked how he was. I said he seemed like he was trying, that time would tell if the change was real. She asked if I'd forgiven him. I said forgiveness was a process, not an event, that I was working on it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she and Dad had been working on it too, that they'd started going to a support group for families affected by incarceration, that they were learning how to hold Ryan accountable while still loving him. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than watching me deploy. Harder than sitting in that hospital in Germany not knowing if I'd survive. I told her I was proud of them, that the work they were doing mattered. She started crying, the good kind of crying that comes with relief. She said she'd been so afraid I'd never speak to them again, that the family would fracture completely, that she'd die without ever seeing her sons in the same room. I told her I couldn't promise what the future held, but I wasn't going anywhere. She said that was enough. Ryan was released after serving 5 years of his 7-year sentence, time reduced for good behavior and program participation. I didn't go to pick him up. That was Dad's job. But I agreed to meet him a week later at a diner halfway between his halfway house and my apartment. He arrived first, sitting in a booth by the window, looking out at the parking lot like he was still getting used to open spaces. I rolled in and he stood, awkward and uncertain, before sitting back down. We ordered coffee. The waitress, an older woman with a name tag that said Dolores, smiled at me and thanked me for my service. She didn't know who Ryan was, what he'd done, what we were doing there. To her, we were just two guys having coffee on a Thursday afternoon. Ryan said he'd gotten a job doing manual labor for a landscaping company, that it was hard work and the pay was terrible, but it was honest. He said he was living in a halfway house with 7 other guys, sharing a bathroom, following a strict curfew. He said it wasn't much different from prison except the doors weren't locked. He asked about me, about the VA work, about Second Foundation. I told him the program had grown, that we'd placed over 200 veterans in jobs, that we were expanding to include housing assistance and mental health support. He said that was good work, that it mattered. I said it did. He asked if there was any chance eventually that he could volunteer. I told him not yet, that the program served veterans and having someone with a fraud conviction in a position of trust would undermine everything we'd built. He said he understood. Said he'd expected that answer but had to ask. We sat in silence for a while, drinking bad coffee, watching cars pull in and out of the lot. Then Ryan said something that surprised me. He said he'd been thinking about Mom and Dad, about the house they'd lost, about the instability they'd faced because of him. He said he wanted to make it right, that he was setting aside part of every paycheck, that it would take years but eventually he'd have enough for a down payment on a small place. He said he wanted to buy them a house, not to erase what he'd done but to give them something solid again. I asked if he'd told them. He said no, that he wanted to actually have the money first, that he was done making promises he couldn't keep. I told him that was probably wise. He asked if I thought they'd accept it. I said I didn't know, that they might see it as him trying to buy forgiveness. He said he wasn't trying to buy anything, that he just wanted to do one thing right. I believed him. We finished our coffee. As I got ready to leave, Ryan asked if we could do this again, not often, just occasionally, just to stay connected. I said maybe, that I'd have to see how I felt, that I couldn't commit to regular contact. He said that was fair. He walked me to my van. Before I got in, he said he knew it didn't change anything, but he wanted me to know he was proud of what I'd built, of the person I'd become despite everything. I said thank you. It was the first time he'd said something like that without it feeling like a comparison or a competition. It was just a statement, clean and simple. I drove away and looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there watching me go, looking small and alone in the empty parking lot. Over the next 2 years, Ryan and I maintained a careful distance. We'd meet for coffee every few months, brief conversations that never went too deep, updates on life and work and family. He kept his job with the landscaping company, got promoted to crew leader, started taking night classes in horticulture. He moved out of the halfway house into a small studio apartment. He stayed sober, went to therapy, showed up when he said he would. Slowly, incrementally, he started to look like someone I could trust. My parents noticed. Mom said he seemed different, calmer, more thoughtful. Dad said he'd stopped making excuses, that when he screwed up he admitted it instead of deflecting. They started spending more time with him, Sunday dinners at their rental, help with yard work, the small ordinary rituals of family. They asked if I'd join them. I said not yet. I wasn't ready for that, for the performance of normalcy, for pretending we were a family that hadn't been broken. But I didn't begrudge them the relationship. They needed their son and he needed them. Meanwhile, Second Foundation continued to grow. We opened a second location, expanded our services, partnered with local colleges to offer skills training. I hired a small staff, people who understood the mission because they'd lived it. One of them was a former Marine named Marcus Webb, who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. He ran our peer mentorship program, connecting newly transitioning veterans with people who'd walked the same path. He was good at it, better than I was, because he had a warmth I'd never quite mastered. One afternoon, Marcus came into my office and closed the door. He said he had an idea but wanted to run it by me first. He said we'd been so focused on employment and housing that we'd overlooked something critical: family reintegration. He said a lot of veterans struggled not just with civilian life, but with reconnecting to families who didn't understand what they'd been through, who expected them to be the same person who'd left. He said family mediation, structured conversations, restorative practices could be a powerful addition to our services. I asked if he had experience with that. He said he'd gone through a program similar to what I'd done with Ryan, that it had saved his relationship with his father. He said it wasn't easy and it didn't always work, but when it did, it changed everything. I thought about the green room in Elkton, about Margaret's steady presence, about the hard conversation that had cracked open a door I'd thought was sealed shut. I told Marcus to develop a proposal. He grinned and said he'd already started. 6 months later, we launched the Family Bridges program. We partnered with trained mediators, therapists who specialized in trauma, and volunteers who'd been through their own reconciliation processes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans and their families signed up faster than we could accommodate them. We heard stories of fathers and sons who hadn't spoken in years, of siblings divided by misunderstandings and unprocessed pain, of marriages strained to the breaking point by deployments and injuries and the invisible wounds of war. Not every mediation succeeded. Some families were too fractured, the damage too deep. But enough of them found healing that the work felt sacred. I sat in on some of the sessions, not as a participant but as an observer, watching people do the hard work of honesty and accountability. I saw the same patterns repeat. The initial defensiveness, the fear of vulnerability, the moment when someone finally said the truth they'd been carrying for years. And the room shifted. I saw people cry and rage and laugh and embrace. I saw broken things become whole in new configurations. One evening after a particularly intense session, Marcus and I sat in the empty conference room, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. He said the work we were doing mattered, that we were giving people a chance to reclaim their lives and their relationships. He said he'd never felt more useful, more aligned with his purpose. I told him I felt the same. He asked if I'd ever considered going through the program with Ryan again, now that some time had passed. I said I had, that I'd been thinking about it more lately, that maybe there was more to say. He said I'd know when the time was right. 2 weeks later, I called Ryan and asked if he wanted to do another mediation session. He said yes immediately. We scheduled it for a Saturday morning at the Second Foundation office. Margaret had retired, but I'd stayed in touch with her, and she agreed to facilitate. When Ryan arrived, he looked nervous but steady. We sat across from each other at the same kind of round table we'd used in the prison. Margaret opened the same way she had before, outlining the structure, emphasizing safety and honesty. She asked what had changed since our last session. Ryan said he'd spent 2 years working on himself, that he understood more about the person he'd been and the person he wanted to become. He said he'd made amends where he could, that he'd saved enough to put a down payment on a small house for our parents, that he'd given it to them last month with no strings attached. I hadn't known that. I looked at him surprised. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want credit, that it was something he needed to do for himself as much as for them. Margaret asked what I wanted from this session. I said I wanted to understand if we could build something new, if the relationship could evolve beyond polite distance into something resembling brotherhood. Ryan said he wanted that too, that he missed having a brother, that the years of separation had shown him what he'd lost. We talked for 3 hours. We revisited old wounds, acknowledged new growth, explored what trust looked like when it had to be rebuilt from nothing. We talked about boundaries and expectations and the reality that some damage was permanent. We also talked about hope, about the possibility that broken things could be stronger at the mend if the work was done right. By the end, we'd agreed to try. Not to force it, not to pretend the past hadn't happened, but to show up honestly and see what emerged. 5 years after Ryan's release, our parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. They threw a small party at the house Ryan had bought them, a modest 2-bedroom with a ramp leading to the front door that Dad had insisted on installing himself. The whole family was there. Me, Ryan, Rachel, who'd remarried but stayed friendly with all of us, a handful of aunts and uncles and cousins. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in years. Genuine laughter instead of forced pleasantness. Dad stood up to make a toast. He talked about 50 years of marriage, about the highs and lows, about the mistakes he'd made and the grace he'd been given. He talked about his sons, about the different paths we'd taken, about the pain we'd caused each other and the healing we'd fought for. He said he was proud of both of us, not for what we'd achieved but for who we'd become in the aftermath of our failures. He raised his glass and said family wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present. Ryan caught my eye across the room. He raised his glass toward me, a small gesture, a question. I raised mine back. Not forgiveness exactly, not forgetting, but acknowledgement. Recognition that we were both still here, still trying, still willing to do the hard work of being family. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, Ryan and I sat on the back porch. The yard was small but well kept, beds of flowers that Ryan had planted, a vegetable garden that Dad tended. The sky was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. Ryan said he'd been thinking about the future, about what came next now that he'd stabilized his life. He said he wanted to do something meaningful, something that helped people the way Second Foundation had helped so many veterans. He asked if there was room in the organization for him, not in a leadership role, just something where he could contribute. I told him we had an opening in our logistics department, coordinating donations and managing inventory. It was behind-the-scenes work, no client contact, no position of authority. He said that sounded perfect. He started the following month. He showed up on time, did the work without complaint, stayed in his lane. The staff who knew his history were skeptical at first, but he won them over slowly through consistency and humility. He never tried to insert himself into conversations about veteran issues. He never claimed to understand things he hadn't experienced. He just did his job and went home. Over time, he became a valued member of the team, someone people trusted to follow through. 3 years later, on a cold morning in November, I received a call from the Department of Defense. They were hosting a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients, and wanted to know if I'd participate in a panel discussion about service and sacrifice. I agreed. The event was in Washington, D.C., a formal affair with high-ranking officials and media coverage. I wore my dress uniform, the medal around my neck, feeling the weight of it both literally and metaphorically. During the panel, a young soldier asked how I'd found purpose after leaving the military. I talked about Second Foundation, about helping other veterans navigate the transition, about building something that mattered. I talked about family, about the fractures and the slow work of repair. I talked about my brother, about betrayal and accountability, and the possibility of redemption. I didn't use his name, but I told the story honestly. I said the hardest battles weren't always the ones fought overseas, that sometimes the enemy was closer to home, that courage looked different in peacetime but it was no less necessary. The room was silent when I finished. Afterwards, several people approached me, veterans and family members, thanking me for the honesty, saying they'd faced similar situations and felt less alone knowing someone else had walked that path. When I returned to Columbus, Ryan picked me up from the airport. It had become a routine, these small gestures of connection. Him showing up when I needed a ride, me calling him when I had news to share. On the drive home, I told him about the panel, about the question and my answer. I told him I'd talked about him, about what had happened between us. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I told them the whole truth. I said yes, that I'd talked about the fraud and the trial and the years of separation. He asked how people had responded. I said they'd understood, that pain and betrayal and hard choices weren't unique to us, that every family had its own version of the story. He said he was glad I'd been honest, that hiding the truth had caused enough damage. He said he never wanted to be the reason I had to lie again. We drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ryan said something I hadn't expected. He said he'd been seeing someone, a woman named Claire he'd met at a community garden project. He said it was early, nothing serious yet, but she knew about his past and hadn't run away. He said he'd told her everything about the fraud, the prison time, the work he was doing to become someone different. He said she'd listened and then asked what kind of flowers he liked. He laughed when he said it, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. I told him I was happy for him. He said he was happy too, that for the first time in years he felt like he was building a life instead of just surviving one. When we pulled up to my building, he helped me get my bags out of the trunk. Before I went inside, he said thank you for giving me another chance, for not writing me off completely. I said I hadn't given him a chance. He'd earned it. There was a difference. He nodded, said he understood that he'd keep earning it every day for as long as it took. I believed him. That night, I sat in my apartment looking at the medal on my desk. I thought about all the weight it carried, all the lives it represented, all the choices that led to the moment I'd received it. I thought about the speech I'd given at the panel about service and sacrifice and the different forms courage could take. I thought about Ryan in prison doing the hard work of transformation. About my parents rebuilding their lives in a smaller house with a bigger heart. About Rachel finding her own path. About all of us broken and mending, failing and trying again. I thought about the words I'd spoken to Ryan years ago in that green room in Elkton, about broken things being stronger at the mend. I hadn't fully believed it then. It had been something to say, a hope more than a conviction. But sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, looking at the life I'd built from the wreckage, I realized it was true. The cracks were where the light got in. The breaks were where we learned to flex instead of shatter. The falls were what taught us how to stand. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Sunday dinner this week? Your father's making his famous chili. Ryan and Claire are coming. I typed back a response. I'll be there. The message sent and I set the phone down. Outside my window, the city lights flickered against the darkness. Each one a life being lived, a story being written, a person trying to find their way. I was one of them. Just another person doing the best I could with what I had left. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Sunday dinner became a regular fixture in our lives. A weekly gathering that marked time and progress in ways no calendar could. My parents' house, the one Ryan had bought them, slowly filled with new memories that overlapped the old ones without erasing them. Claire became a fixture too, her quiet presence a steadying influence on Ryan. Her garden expertise transforming the small backyard into something worth looking at. She had a way of asking questions that got people talking, drawing out stories my father had never told, making my mother laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. One evening after dinner, while Claire and my mother washed dishes and my father dozed in his recliner, Ryan and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset behind the neighbor's fence. He told me Claire had asked him to move in with her, that she had a small house across town with enough room for both of them and a real garden space. He said he was thinking about it but wanted to know if I thought it was too soon, if he was rushing into something before he'd fully sorted himself out. I asked him what he was afraid of. He said he was afraid of bringing his past into her life, of her waking up one day and realizing she'd signed up for more baggage than she could carry. I told him that was her decision to make, not his, that treating her like she couldn't handle the truth was just another form of dishonesty. He nodded slowly, said I was right, that he'd been so focused on protecting her from his mistakes that he hadn't considered he might be underestimating her strength. I told him the strongest people I knew were the ones who'd seen the worst and chosen to stay anyway. He asked if I was talking about Claire or about myself. I said both. He moved in with Claire 2 months later. The change was good for him. He started smiling more, worrying less, carrying himself like someone who'd finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. He brought her to family dinners, and she fit in so naturally it was easy to forget she hadn't always been there. My mother loved her immediately, loved the way she listened, the way she remembered details, the way she made Ryan softer around the edges. My father appreciated her directness, the fact that she didn't tiptoe around difficult subjects, but addressed them with a practicality that matched his own. The following spring, Second Foundation received a grant from a national veterans organization to expand our services statewide. It was more money than we'd ever had access to, enough to open 3 new offices, hire additional staff, and develop programs we'd only dreamed about. Marcus and I spent weeks planning, mapping out locations, interviewing candidates, designing curricula. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. We decided one of the new offices should be in Elkton, close to the federal prison, specifically to serve veterans transitioning out of incarceration. The irony wasn't lost on me. The place where I'd first sat across from Ryan in that green room would now house a program designed to help people like him rebuild their lives. Marcus said it felt right that we should plant hope in the places that needed it most. We hired a formerly incarcerated veteran named David Chan to run the Elkton office. David had served in the Navy, got out, struggled with addiction, made bad choices, and served 4 years for armed robbery. He'd been clean for 6 years, had a degree in social work, and understood both the military and the criminal justice system in ways most people never would. He also had a quiet intensity that put people at ease, a sense that he'd seen the bottom and clawed his way back up. During his interview, I'd asked him what he thought veterans coming out of prison needed most. He'd said the same thing everyone needs, to be seen as more than the worst thing they'd ever done. I hired him on the spot. The Elkton office opened on a gray Tuesday morning. We held a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, just a ribbon cutting and some remarks from local officials who were happy to attach their names to something positive. David gave a short speech about second chances and the responsibility that came with them. He said freedom wasn't just about getting out of a cage, it was about building a life worth living on the other side. The local newspaper covered it, ran a piece about the program and its mission. The article mentioned my role, my background, my Medal of Honor. It also mentioned that my brother had served time at the same facility and was now working with Second Foundation in a support capacity. I hadn't expected them to make that connection, but the reporter had done her research. When the article came out, I braced for backlash, for people to question how someone with a criminal brother could run a program for veterans, for the inevitable scrutiny that comes with any hint of controversy. Instead, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People wrote emails and letters saying the story gave them hope, that it proved families could survive devastating mistakes, that accountability and redemption weren't mutually exclusive. Several veterans reached out saying they had siblings or children who'd made serious mistakes, and they didn't know how to maintain the relationship while still holding boundaries. They asked for advice, for resources, for permission to feel conflicted. I responded to every message personally, sharing what I'd learned, acknowledging that there were no easy answers, offering the reminder that healing took time and couldn't be forced. Ryan called me the day the article came out. He said he'd seen it, that a coworker had brought it to his attention. He asked if I was okay with my story being tied to his so publicly. I told him the truth was the truth, that I wasn't going to hide our history to make things easier. He said he appreciated that it meant more than I probably realized. He said Claire had read the article too, that she'd cried, that she'd told him she was proud of both of us for doing the work even when it was hard. That summer, my father's health started declining. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age and wear. His knees, already bad, got worse. He started using a cane, then a walker, then reluctantly agreed to a wheelchair for longer distances. The irony of us both navigating the world on wheels wasn't lost on either of us. One afternoon, I took him to a VA appointment, wheeling beside him down the long corridors, both of us moving at the same pace for once. He made a joke about it, said we should start a racing team. I told him we'd get smoked by the younger guys. He laughed, said we'd have more fun losing together than winning alone. In the waiting room, he asked me if I'd ever regretted turning Ryan in, if I ever wished I'd handled it differently. I said I regretted that it had been necessary, but I didn't regret the choice itself. He nodded, said he understood that he'd spent a lot of time thinking about his own choices, about the signatures he'd authorized, the questions he hadn't asked. He said he'd been a coward, that he'd taken the easy path because confronting Ryan would have meant admitting his own failures as a father. I told him we'd all failed in different ways, that the point wasn't to catalog the mistakes but to learn from them. He said he was trying, that some days were harder than others, that guilt was a persistent companion. I told him guilt was useful only if it changed behavior, otherwise it was just self-indulgence. He looked at me surprised, then laughed. He said I'd become wise somewhere along the way. I said I just lived long enough to make every mistake once. That fall, Ryan proposed to Claire. He did it simply, no grand gesture, just the two of them in the garden she'd built, surrounded by the last blooms of the season. She said yes. They planned a small wedding for the following spring, immediate family only, a ceremony in their backyard followed by dinner at a local restaurant. My mother immediately went into planning mode, offering to help with flowers and food, and all the details that come with merging two lives. Claire accepted gracefully, letting my mother feel useful, feel needed, feel like she was part of something joyful instead of just managing damage. Ryan asked me to be his best man. I said yes, though the role felt weighted with history, with the memory of standing beside him at his first wedding, before deployments and distance and betrayal had reshaped everything. He said he understood if it was too much, that he'd chosen me not out of obligation but because he wanted me there, wanted the person who'd held him accountable to also witness him trying to do better. I told him I'd be honored. The wedding took place on a Saturday in April, the garden in full bloom, tulips and daffodils and cherry blossoms creating a backdrop that looked almost unreal in its beauty. Claire wore a simple cream dress. Ryan wore a suit that actually fit. My parents sat in the front row, my mother dabbing her eyes, my father's hand covering hers. I stood beside Ryan, watching him watch Claire walk toward him, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of acceptance. The officiant, a friend of Claire's, kept the ceremony short and meaningful. When it came time for the vows, Ryan spoke without notes. He said he'd spent years living a lie, building a life on foundations that couldn't hold, and it had cost him everything that mattered. He said Claire had seen him at his worst, knew every mistake he'd made, and chose him anyway. He said he didn't deserve that kind of grace, but he'd spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. Claire's vows were simpler. She said she loved him not despite his past, but because of who he'd become in response to it. She said broken things, when mended with care, were often stronger than things that had never been tested. She said she was grateful for the chance to build something together, something honest and real. They exchanged rings. The officiant pronounced them married. Ryan kissed his wife and the small gathering applauded. During the reception, my father gave a toast. He talked about family, about the ways we hurt each other and the ways we heal. He said he'd made mistakes as a father, that he'd enabled behavior he should have confronted, that he'd prioritized comfort over truth. He said watching his sons navigate the aftermath had taught him more about courage than anything else in his life. He raised his glass and said here's to second chances and the people brave enough to take them. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, I found myself alone with Ryan in the garden. The sun had set, string lights casting a warm glow over the space Claire had created. Ryan loosened his tie and sat on a bench near the vegetable beds. I rolled up beside him. He said thank you for being here, for standing with him, for not giving up even when he'd given me every reason to. I told him I'd almost given up a dozen times, that there were moments when walking away would have been easier. He asked what stopped me. I said stubbornness mostly, and the belief that people could change if they wanted to badly enough. He said he'd wanted to. That prison had given him time to realize the person he'd been was someone he despised. He said the work of becoming someone different was ongoing, that some days were harder than others, that he still struggled with shame and regret. I told him that was normal, that transformation wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't erase progress. He asked if I trusted him now. I said I trusted him more than I had, that trust was something rebuilt slowly, that he'd been consistent enough long enough that the foundation felt solid. He said that meant everything, that my opinion mattered more than anyone else's. I told him he should care more about Claire's opinion now. He smiled, said he did, but that didn't diminish what my acceptance meant. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. Then Ryan said something that surprised me. He said he'd been thinking about applying to graduate school, that he wanted to study restorative justice, to formalize his understanding of the work we were doing at Second Foundation. He said he wanted to help other people navigate the process he'd been through, to facilitate conversations between people who'd harmed each other, and wanted to find a way forward. I asked if he thought he was ready for that. He said he didn't know if anyone was ever ready, but he felt called to it, felt like his experience could be useful if he channeled it correctly. I told him to apply, that the worst they could say was no, that even the process of articulating his goals would clarify his thinking. He said he would, that Claire had already encouraged him to go for it. I told him he'd picked a good partner. He said he knew. The following year brought changes none of us expected. My father's health deteriorated rapidly. What had been manageable decline became acute crisis. He was hospitalized twice for heart issues, then complications from his medications, then infections that his weakened system couldn't fight effectively. My mother spent most of her time at the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, eating cafeteria food, refusing to leave his side. Ryan and I took turns sitting with her, bringing her real food, convincing her to go home and sleep. Claire managed the practical things, coordinating with doctors, organizing medications, making sure bills got paid and the house stayed functional. In the quiet moments between crises, my father and I talked more honestly than we ever had. He told me about Vietnam, about things he'd never shared, about the friends he'd lost and the guilt he'd carried. He said he understood now why I'd kept going back to Iraq, why I'd stayed on that IED even when I knew it might kill me. He said service was about protecting the people beside you, and that instinct didn't come with an off switch. He said he was proud of me, not just for the medal but for the man I'd become after losing so much. He said he was proud of Ryan too, for facing his mistakes instead of running from them, for doing the hard work even when it would have been easier to stay broken. One evening in late autumn, with golden light slanting through the hospital window, my father called both Ryan and me to his bedside. My mother sat in the corner already crying, knowing what was coming. Dad's voice was weak but clear. He said he didn't have much time left, that the doctors had been honest about that. He said he wanted us to know he loved us both, that he was sorry for the ways he'd failed us, that watching us rebuild our relationship had been the greatest gift of his final years. He made us promise to take care of our mother, to stay connected, to keep doing the work we'd started. We promised. He died 3 days later quietly, with all of us present. The funeral was well attended, veterans from his generation standing in dress uniforms they could barely fit into anymore. Neighbors who'd known him for decades, people from Second Foundation who'd never met him but came to support us. Ryan delivered the eulogy. He talked about our father's service, his work ethic, his stubbornness. He talked about the mistakes Dad had made and the grace he'd shown in acknowledging them. He talked about forgiveness and accountability and the courage it took to change late in life. His voice cracked several times but he made it through. Afterwards at the house, people shared stories and food and the strange comfort that comes from collective grief. My mother sat in her chair, accepting condolences, holding herself together through sheer force of will. When the last guest left, she finally broke down, crying in a way that shook her whole body. Ryan and I sat on either side of her, holding her, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. We stayed like that until the crying stopped and exhaustion took over. In the months after my father's death, my mother leaned into her volunteer work at Second Foundation with renewed intensity. She said it helped to stay busy, to feel useful, to be around people who understood loss. She started facilitating a support group for Gold Star families, parents and spouses who'd lost service members. She was good at it, her own grief making her credible, her natural warmth making her approachable. Ryan and Claire invited her to move in with them, said the house had room and she shouldn't be alone. She declined at first, wanting to maintain her independence, but eventually agreed to spend a few nights a week with them. The arrangement worked. She had space when she needed it and company when she didn't. The following spring, on what would have been my parents' 52nd anniversary, we planted a tree in their backyard. A red oak, the same kind that had been in the front yard of the house I grew up in. My mother, Ryan, Claire, and I stood in a circle around the small sapling, taking turns adding soil, watering it in. My mother said a few words about my father, about the life they'd built, about the family that remained. She said the tree would outlive all of us, that long after we were gone it would still be growing, still reaching toward the sun. She said that felt right, that growth was the best response to loss. Ryan got accepted to graduate school that summer, a program in conflict resolution and restorative justice at a university 2 hours north. He'd been terrified they'd reject him because of his record, but his essay about his own experience with accountability and transformation had apparently resonated with the admissions committee. He'd start in the fall, commute twice a week, finish in 3 years. Claire supported it completely, said she'd hold down the fort while he chased this dream. My mother said she'd never been prouder. I told him he'd better not forget about us when he became a fancy academic. He laughed, said there was zero chance of that happening, that I'd be a guest lecturer in every class he ever taught. As the years accumulated, the sharp edges of our history softened without disappearing entirely. The story of what Ryan had done, what I'd lost, what we'd both fought to rebuild became part of our family narrative, but not the defining feature. We existed in the fullness of our complicated present, honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. Second Foundation continued growing, touching more lives, expanding its mission. We added programs for family members, for children of veterans, for anyone affected by military service. The work was never finished, but it was always meaningful. And through it all, every Sunday when schedules allowed, we gathered for dinner. Sometimes at my mother's place, sometimes at Ryan and Claire's, occasionally at my apartment when I felt like cooking. We shared food and stories and the quiet comfort of people who'd survived something terrible together and chosen to keep showing up. That, I'd learned, was what family really meant. Not perfection, not the absence of pain, but the willingness to stay, to repair, to build something honest from the wreckage of what came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.